Can we, can I get the co-host status to do that, please?
Rajesh, can you sort that, please?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes. Mallikarjun, sir, can you please make Professor Banks the co-host?
Rajesh, I made you host. You have to make her a host. Rajesh.
Yes, sir. Yes, I'm doing it.
You are host, so you have a right to make her host, co-host.
Yes, sir. Done, sir. Professor Banks, it's done. You can check.
Okay. Thank you. Now, can I just double check that everybody can see my screen?
Yep, that's
Yes.
fine. Thanks, Joanne. Okay,
Perfect.
just before I introduce Dr. Banks, then, could I just remind everybody, please, to mute your microphones throughout the presentation? There will be a chance to ask questions at the end, but it's important, I think, that we give Joanne as much opportunity to speak without interruption as we possibly can. So please mute your microphones. Okay, welcome, Joanne. It's a great pleasure for me to be able to introduce Dr. Joanne Banks to you. I've known Joanne for a number of years. She's one of Ireland's preeminent researchers in the field of inclusion and special education, working at Trinity College, Dublin. I knew her before she was at Trinity, actually. And she's done a number of major research projects, not just in Ireland, but internationally as well. She's also the author of many academic papers, and some of you will have previously engaged, no doubt, with her wonderful podcast series where she interviewed a number of eminent people, including, for instance, Professor Janti Narayan, about their role and their ideas on inclusive education. So it's a pleasure to have you here with us today, Joanne. So we'll give you the floor to speak for about half an hour or so, and then we will open up for questions. So thank you very much, and over to you.
Thank you, Richard. And Richard's being very modest there because he also is one of my experts that I interviewed on his podcast. I see Jayanti is in the room here today as well. So hello to you, Jayanti.
Hi, good to see you with us. Looking forward to listening to you.
Indeed. So I'm just very privileged and honoured to be asked to present at the Indian Inclusive Research Network meeting. I'm delighted to be able to share some of the research that I've been carrying out over the past number of years. And I really would be more than interested in hearing your feedback, your own perspective and experience from the Indian perspective and from a global perspective more generally. So the title of my presentation today is Exploring Global Tensions in Special and Inclusive Education. And I deliberately split it into special and inclusive education because there's quite a lot of debate in the inclusive education space in Ireland at the moment. And I would love to hear if there's any parallels in India and elsewhere. But special education is very much a firm fixture of most education systems around the world. And this very much comes up in the findings that I'll show you now. I'm a lecturer in inclusive education in Trinity College, and I run a number of master's programs on diversity and inclusion in education. And I'm doing some research in the further education and higher education space in universal design as well. So I just maybe open firstly by the content of this talk that I'm giving here to you is on my podcast, as Richard pointed out, and also the book that I published last year, which was based on the series of interviews with 12 global experts in inclusive education. And I really sought to try and get a global perspective here. It's difficult, obviously, to get a full representation from around the world, but I was very privileged to talk to some really interesting people, and I learned an awful lot from this experience. And they very kindly contributed chapters to my book, The Inclusion Dialogue. And this podcast itself is available on Spotify. It's available for free. So I use this podcast primarily with my students, but the feedback over the last number of years has been that it extends far beyond the student body. And there's many policymakers and academics and parents and students themselves who use the podcast and have taken something from it, which was lovely to hear. I thought today, because I'm from Ireland and I work in the Irish context, that it might be interesting to just give an overview of the Irish education system. I suppose so that you can draw some comparisons and differences between Ireland and maybe the Indian context. You know, it's just interesting to see how the system here works. So we have primarily an academic track all the way through children's education, and we don't really have alternative options for students until upper senior cycle, when there is one program at leaving terminal examination. It's our high stakes end of school examination. Students can opt for a pre-vocational programme here in Ireland called the Leaving Certificate Applied, but the majority of students take what's called the Leaving Certificate Established. Most students attend a mainstream setting. Traditionally, that's where they've gone, and students with disabilities have tended to go to, we have 123 special schools, 125 special schools here in Ireland that is aimed at children aged between 5 years and 18 years. Okay, as students progress, and if they do progress to further higher education, training and employment, the language changes somewhat from special needs and special supports to disability services, which are far, I suppose, as students tend to make this transition, the research would suggest there's far less supports than students would have received at the school level. I just want to make one observation. In recent years, since about 2011, myself and Professor Michael Shevlin here in the School of Education in Trinity College, we have written extensively about the use and the role of special classes in the Irish education system. So these are classes that are based in mainstream educational settings, where students have a ratio of 6 students to 1 teacher with 2 special educational needs assistants in the room. They're generally designated for students with autism. And there's been a dramatic increase in the number of these classes, with over 3,000 classes in operation today. And we have no evaluation of the effectiveness of these classes for young people. So this is an area of much tension in Irish media and political space as well. And we only recently had a report published by government on Tuesday addressing this exact issue of whether we want to have separate provision for children and young people with identified needs, or unidentified needs often is the case, or whether we want a full inclusive system. Okay. So in today's talk, what I'd like to do is I tried to draw some of the main themes that came out of the interviews with global experts and put them into some kind of a thematic structure, so that perhaps we can talk about that in the Q&A. The first part of this talk is going to be false oppositions, was used by one of my contributors. And it's in relation to the definition of inclusion and how we define inclusion and the complexities in defining inclusion for a lot of governments and education systems. I'll then talk through the system level trends, where you know, the majority of countries are operating in some kind of a special and mainstream offerings for students with disabilities. I'll talk through the theme that arose in most of the interviews I had, which was on the role of teacher education in creating inclusive environments. As you can imagine, today's talk it was very firmly came out in the interviews, the importance of adopting inclusive pedagogy. And then perhaps something that didn't arise consistently throughout the interviews, but it's something that I have quite an interest in, and it's the role of parents, parents of students with disabilities, and I suppose the role as a stakeholder and their involvement in decisions about whether we adopt inclusive or special systems in our education. So first, I thought I'd give some context really to the kind of most of the interviews, and in each of case, a lot of the contributors talked about the importance of recognizing and understanding the context in the country where policies are being introduced or discussed, but also equally the history and the legacy of different systems that exists there. In particular, a number of contributors talked about the dangers of policy borrowing, where often policies that perhaps are developed in the West, if you like, countries being adopted by countries where they have very, very different economic circumstances, cultural perspectives, philosophical assumptions around education, and that the importance of recognizing that there are different contexts, that an inclusion can be interpreted, I think, very, very differently depending on those contexts. I know Gary Hornby spoke at this event, I think before Christmas, if my memory serves me correctly, and he really raised, he was one of my contributors, and he really raised the point around, is the definition that we have of inclusive education, is it an illusion? And can we truly design an education system that is inclusive? And this was contested quite a bit amongst the different contributors to the podcast and the book. But I think in the main, many people emphasize the importance of having a definition in order to know the direction of travel in terms of where our education systems and our policies wish to go. The other thing that was raised, and I think I have a second series of the podcast, and there's actually a book I'm writing at the moment on that second series, and it possibly came out in the second series a little bit more, but it's about the exploring of that definition of inclusion, but focusing not just on disability, but other barriers that children and young people experience in their learning. And depending on where you are, it can be around ethnicity, it can be around gender, and often underlying a lot of the barriers is socioeconomic deprivation of young people in accessing education. And importantly, what's come out in that second book and podcast is an area I'm sure you're more than familiar with, which is the intersectionality of many of these characteristics, if you like, of a student, which can have a compounding effect and have kind of multiple layers of disadvantage to kind of prevent that child accessing the curriculum or their education. And then the final point is really about the history. And in Ireland, this has huge relevance, really, because we have, from the 19th century, had religious orders running schools for children who were deaf or hard of hearing or blind. And the legacy of that really, and the development of special classes then in the mid-20th century, but the legacy of that has really influenced the way we operate our education system here today. And I presume perhaps you can add to this afterwards, but that will influence our current provision and our current education system. So I'll move on to this discussion around the false oppositions, which was, I think, a term by Professor Bram Norwich, who described the importance of defining inclusion and the need for that, particularly amongst international policies and like the UNCRPD, for example. But a number of contributors spoke about the importance of defining non-inclusion, and General Comment 4 of the UNCRPD for the very first time described what it means, what segregation, for example, means, what inclusion actually means. And this is, in often ways, is a way for countries to perhaps measure themselves as whether they are compliant with the aspects of the UNCRPD. And when I use it on the Irish perspective, you can very much see that our provision of special classes very firmly falls within the definition of segregation. Now, that conversation isn't really happening here in Ireland, but when you compare your provision against the policy, there's a gap there. And in the Irish case, there is too. A number of contributors talked about the kind of polarization of the views around the need for special education and the need for inclusive education, and that perhaps the conversation is more nuanced than people think, or perhaps should be more nuanced, and that this dichotomy is created between, are you an inclusionist or pro-special education? With the question is it an either or matter, or can we have inclusive education systems where there also exists specialist supports for students that need it? So that's, again, perhaps something, this is more food for thought, I think, rather than me. I'm certainly not going to give you any answers here today. So system level trends. This came up again and again. You can see how many contributors talked about this within their interviews with me. So most countries around the world operate parallel systems of special and inclusive education, there's no doubt, with many operating special schools, some countries changing the function of special schools into perhaps resource centres for mainstream education, but also that the special classes is a phenomenon that's happening again more and more over the world. The language around special classes changes from context to context, however. Julie Allen in particular and Lani Florian, of course, raised the dilemma of difference, where Obviously, it's important and valuable to the students that they are identified in order to receive resources or supports that will support them if they do have a disability in school. But in many ways, the identification of that kind of identifies them socially and can perhaps in itself become a barrier to their learning. I know from the conversation with Gary Hornby, he raised the idea of the evidence base for fully inclusive environments for students with disabilities, and I'm sure he spoke about that at the lecture he gave to this particular group. Equally, other contributors talk about the lack of evidence, and I've published on this myself, for you know, whether specialized or separate placement is the optimum place for students with disabilities. And I suppose how variable the decision to place students in special education can be from one school context to another. So the evidence base for either specialized provision or inclusive education is quite weak, because I suppose these are a lot of the successes on inclusion are extremely hard to measure. They're not tangible, and they're often the kind of soft skills that, you know, they're not academic test scores, I suppose is what I'm trying to say. So I'm just going to move now on to a theme that I can say was striking throughout most of the interviews and chapters that are in the book as well, which is around teacher education, but equally around the kind of changing role of the teacher. And I would be really interested to see whether these conversations apply in the Indian context too. So Lani Florian talks a lot about the need for teachers with their basic teacher qualification to feel empowered to teach every student. And in recent years, the conversation has moved to the need for more specialized education for teachers to teach students with disabilities. And she sees this as something that's quite disempowering for teachers, and that perhaps makes them think that they need to have expertise in a certain area in order to teach students with, for example, dyslexia or whatever it might be, but that they need to become empowered in themselves and stand over themselves as human beings with a qualification that can teach every student. Julie Allen talks about the pressures of teaching, and she raises the idea of the role of accountability and the high stakes nature of exams in introducing the normalizing imperative for teachers, where when students are in the classroom that represent a challenge for the teacher, that instead of using those students to enhance teaching and learning in the class overall, that they are kind of forced, if you like, to problematize that student and consider it a challenge. And of course, then have the tendency to think they need to go somewhere else in order to be educated. In Ireland, certainly, we have, in the last 20 years, a huge amount of kind of changing demographics in our student population, with a far more diverse student population than we had previously. So teachers have had to come up to speed with that diversity in the classroom. But equally, there's a conversation amongst teacher unions here in Ireland, and the media and politics as well, around the inclusion rhetoric, where we talk a very good game around inclusion. We write beautiful policy on inclusion, but it doesn't trickle down to practice. So many teachers feel quite frustrated at the lack of action at government level and to support them in their teaching for this increasingly diverse student body. Much of the emphasis in terms of the solutions here was a very progressive transformation of initial teacher education and professional development or professional learning as teachers move through their careers. I myself work in initial teacher education. I provide students with a single module at the beginning of their 2-year master's program, and they never see me again. So, you know, if I think it's really important that inclusive education underpins their entire postgraduate qualification, rather than it being seen perhaps by them as an add-on or something they can opt into or out of. So the conversation there would naturally move to the role of creating universal access at school level, rather than perhaps toolkits for different characteristics or disabilities in order to teach them. This naturally moves into the conversation around inclusive pedagogy, and perhaps the most well-known inclusive pedagogy is universal design for learning. And this has gained significant momentum in the Irish context in recent years, but was equally raised by a number of the podcasters and the authors of the chapters. And I think UDL is a really important way of trying to understand how the education system itself has the capacity. It can empower its teachers to feel and be aware that they teach to the majority of the school population, but it doesn't remove the need for more specialised supports and perhaps withdrawal or separate instruction for some students at certain times of the day or year or whatever. Kate de Bruin talks extensively in the book about multi-tiered systems of support, which she sees as a really important way for schools at a system level to fully understand how to teach to the majority of students at this base layer of this triangle, but equally at the same time strategically provide interventions for students, and then moving up then to the top of the triangle, where perhaps more specialised or one-to-one supports or technology is available for some students where it is needed. So my final theme that was raised in the podcast is something that I suppose I would like to perhaps research in the future. And I'm wondering, have any of you come across this? But it's about the role of parents, and in any effort in the Irish government, but internationally as well, particularly in Australia, where I'm most familiar with, in order to get buy-in and to gain any momentum in terms of creating a fully inclusive education system, nothing can happen unless the parents are satisfied that their children are going to be fully supported as they have been, perhaps when they've been receiving separate supports or tuition. So parents in the Irish context, certainly I can speak to that, often become advocates and have described to me about the battle that they face against the education system in order to get basic level supports for their children, depending on the disability often as well. Julie Allen talks about them as quite passive partners in these conversations on special and inclusive education and policy, and perhaps their role over time, and that parents now are far more involved in school life than they were 20 or 30 years ago, but yet parents of students with disabilities still have this kind of passive role. And in general, Elainsco and others have talked about the only way is to reach out to the parents and the community more broadly in order to gain consensus on adopting an inclusive education model, if you like. So I've just given some references there as well, but I'm more than happy to, I'd love to hear your observations, your thoughts, and any questions you have, I'm happy to answer. I can stop sharing my screen, Richard, if you like now.
Okay, thank you very much, Joanne. That was very concise, very clear, and I think very helpful. And we will open it to discussion. One observation I would perhaps make right from the start is the very important point you made about not seeing kind of training or information about inclusion and special educational needs as an add-on, but something which needs to be embedded in all of the work that we do. I think there's still a tendency in many places to see the special needs expert and the special needs course as being something additional to what is required by professionals. And you made that point very, very well, I thought, within that presentation. But enough from me. It's more important to hear from other people. So if you'd like to raise your hand if you've got a question, please, and I'll try and bring you in turn, as it were.
Don't be shy.
I'm sure they're not shy usually. Joanne, before we get somebody there in a minute, they're just all waking up to what they want to say.
Richard?
Yes, Malti, would you like to give a question?
Dr. Banks, a wonderful, wonderful session, and followed by the earlier one that we had of Dr. Hornby, and then now, myths of inclusive education, global tensions of inclusive education. I remember when we started off learning about inclusive education, it seemed like there's so much to do, but then now you hear the other side of the picture, which kind of gives a feeling of there's so much, much, much more to do than what we are currently doing. That's one. The second, which was of great interest to me, was your last point on parents as forgotten stakeholders. Especially for me on my topic of social emotional learning, is how much of that does it have a bearing on how parents work with their children on social emotional learning? Because that's something in India, we don't see too much of it in the policy. So as it is, it's very nascent. Two, if it is parents as forgotten stakeholders, then how is it going to have an impact on how parents work with children on their social and emotional competencies?
I have no answer to that, but it's a fantastic question. And I think the isolation that some parents experience means that they often have to cope and create their own like actual tuition and education for their children. But as you mentioned, the social and emotional, that well-being piece for that young person who might themselves be struggling in school. They might be experiencing behavioral difficulties in school as a result of the academic difficulties they might be having. And I think it very much then would suggest to me that the parents that have the resources to perhaps get supports privately at home will separate themselves from the parents that cannot. So I'd say it's socially stratified as to how, that's just an assumption or a suggestion that I have, but yeah, excellent question, but I don't have the answer to that.
We'll search for the answers together, I guess.
Yeah.
Thank you. Professor Sujata Band, you have a question?
Not a question. Hi. Thank you for a wonderful, wonderful presentation, Dr. Banks. And we were introduced through Ashna, and here I am.
Yes, lovely to meet you. Yes, of course. I didn't recognize your name. Yes, lovely to meet you, Sujata. Yes.
I'm just wondering, it's like our previous presentation was also highlighting, we are talking about inclusion everywhere in the world. Are our schools really inclusive? Are our children better off in special schools? Today, you're kind of reinforcing the same thought. And I completely agree that even in our Indian context, the more you speak to the parents, the more you speak to the teachers and special educators, somewhere what's coming out is wherever inclusive education is supposed to be practiced, it's not really the true inclusion. The child is not really actively engaged, but they are maybe their personal sense of personal worth, self-esteem, or they're generally happier when they are in special schools. Parents are also comparatively more involved when their children are in special schools rather than when they are in the inclusive school settings. So my question is like my own dilemma. You know,
Yes.
I'm also an advocate of inclusive education. Are we on the right track? Are we really, or we are just, it's just a rhetoric, as you also use the word rhetoric. Is it just the rhetoric? Because where do we draw that line where we say, okay, this child is not fit for an inclusive class and this child needs to go to the special class? Where do we draw that line? And it becomes rather fuzzy in my head, like I don't know. Yeah, that's my
excellent question yet again. And I draw on Elani Florian's conversation, and she because I kind of think I put this to her a little bit, and she just said it's not what we do, it's not the systems and structures we put in place, it's how we do it. And I think I took a lot from that, where you have a visionary leader, where you have teachers who are brought into that kind of vision and understanding of a universally designed, a whole school approach to universal design, instead of it being outsourced to the special education teacher down the corridor. Every teacher is involved in the inclusion of every student, responsible for that student. Leadership is a huge theme that came out. I didn't have the opportunity to go into it there today, but in 15 years, where the school leader is strong and where they fully support their staff and where they rotate the responsibility of the special ed support role around the staff instead of having it on one teacher for a prolonged period, they have buy-in, and the parents experience the benefits of that, but possibly more importantly, the children and young people do. In research that I've carried out, just as an example, I was in a school that offered 2 special classes, and it's possibly the most inclusive school I've ever been in, because the principal had a vision for the aim of the students on entering that special class was to get them back out again eventually. So they had a goal for the class. It wasn't seen as a place where you would hold a child, or where you would perhaps keep a child and have that kind of content, that kind of safe haven that you're describing, which we did find in some of the research as well. But instead, it's a progression route through. where this child would spend time there building themselves back up for the mainstream environment. But yeah, very good.
Okay,
Thank you.
A couple of other people waiting, so perhaps first Dr. Divya Dubey and then Dr. Rashmi afterwards. So Divya.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Banks, for the very crisp and comprehensive session. I don't really have a question, but just some reflections that from my research and from whatever I've heard from you and all the others. I mean, in a way, it's wonderful to see that, or it's heartening, or it's just like, we are all facing the similar dilemmas in different parts of the world, and similar topics keep coming up. So I'm especially going to speak about two things. One is about teacher education and empowerment, because that was also a topic of my research. And yes, definitely my research, which was also based in 4 cities in India, it found out that there are pressures and challenges that mainstream teachers face. And a lot of it has to come from, the high stakes exams, as you mentioned, because here also in India, we have the board exams, and, the focus of a mainstream teacher is kind of almost entirely on that. And when she is supposed to also take care of the so-called special children in the class, then, as you said, the teachers find themselves not equipped or not empowered enough to do something, because they say, if you start teaching some children, if you pay more attention, then what happens to the rest of the class? I'm accountable to deliver results, so to say. So that is one thing I wanted to say. And the part about parents, so one of the challenges that came up when the teacher spoke about, what are the challenges in inclusion, they said parent involvement and understanding. So it was kind of a different perspective, where they say that, when parents don't understand, or they don't accept, or they don't cooperate, then it becomes difficult for me as a teacher to actually provide support to the child. So that was another, aspect to the whole thing about parents' involvement and things like that. And of course, as Joanne and others have said, yeah, we are all facing similar dilemmas. I don't know what is the right answer, but I think we are together trying to find some solutions. But pretty much that's how the system works in India as well. So just these comments. Thank you so much.
That's really great to hear, or interesting to hear, that the same problems are being faced by teachers and practitioners. And I think bringing parents along with an inclusive school is such an important part of the process. But you have to understand, their fear and anxiety around perhaps moving to where the direct one-to-one supports aren't as readily available. So it is a real dilemma here in Ireland too. Yeah.
Thank you, Divya, for your comments. Dr. Rashmi Rajan, please.
Hello, thank you. Joanna, that was really great. And I was wondering if you could tell me a little bit more about that intersectional aspect of looking at inclusion, and what came out of the interviews that you were doing, because my own PhD work took an intersectional approach to sort of try and reconceptualize inclusive education for the Indian context, because of just the complexity of the context, and also this idea that maybe we could learn a bit more about, or maybe try to reformulate the definition of inclusion by looking at small rural government schools, because their special education is not accessible. Disability assessment is not accessible, but children come into school, diverse children come into school because of the Right to Education Act of India, where no government school can say no to a child. And these are small schools who don't have access to these sort of services. And how do teachers sort of manage, and do they have the training to be able to teach those sort of diverse sets of students? And maybe we could learn more from them by moving away from that, to try and understand the context that they're in, how they're able to still achieve certain educational goals without access to those services. And could that maybe give us a better idea of what inclusion could be and could look like?
Yeah, really good. I mean, I'll come to your intersectional point first, Rashmi. Like there's some really nice discussions by Professor Sheila Riddell, for example, about children in Scotland, and just I suppose the intersection. And Richard, in your own talk, you talked about the intersection of poverty and disability, and how, we don't know which direction that necessarily goes to, but it's a compounding effect for the child or young person. But Professor Riddell talks, I think, quite well from the kind of sociology of education perspective around the role of capital in shaping parents' ability to respond to their child's needs. So where there is kind of strong cultural capital, if you like, that they have access to what this policy means, the legality of perhaps the supports they're being offered or not offered, their role in appeals to schools or government. Whereas parents and families that perhaps don't have that level of capital are perhaps more lost in the system in that way. Like your thesis sounds fascinating. Intersectionality is quite a strong theme in my school of education in relation to gender, ethnicity, but I'm on my research area would I suppose be very much interested in looking at the kind of intersection between special education or disability and social economic disadvantage. The literature there for some reason isn't quite as developed as you'd like to see it, because anecdotally and through some of the research it has come up as a finding. You know, so in relation to your small rural schools, we have in the Irish education system, we have a huge system of small primary rural schools. So I can possibly speak to that a little bit, and a lot of them do not have the capacity or the ability to operate specialized provision within them. They don't have special classes. Now that can go either way, where the school has to respond to the diversity that arrives through its own teachers, because it has no choice. It doesn't have the option of a separate provision, right? So sometimes these schools can be quite inclusive. They've no choice but to be. But in other cases, we know, we actually brought legislation in recently about barriers on entry for parents wishing to access a school where they are receiving messages from principals that perhaps the school further away is more suited because it has more support. So there might be a kind of a sorting mechanism on entry into the school. But I'd love to hear more about the extent of whether that's an option in the Indian context. How remote are these rural schools, and is the next local school down the way viable or not?
Yeah, no, the school that I went to was quite remote. So it was about 15 kilometers away from motorable roadways. And it sort of catered to children coming from different villages around a 3-kilometer radius. And so you had around this 3-kilometer radius, so you just have one primary school, one upper primary school, one high school. So it's pretty remote. So they don't really have the option of maybe accessing some of the school, but at the same time, we do have out migration, where some parents who do have the economic means and the abilities, they decide to move out of the village and go to a bigger town or a city to be able to access private education there. But yeah, the context was pretty complex there. And I sort of looked at more intersections of not just gender and disability. And the other problem was that there was no formal recognition of disability in a lot of instances. And so this whole aspect of even sort of formalizing that recognition of disability can itself be quite ableist and disableist in that sense. So, but at the same time, those families risk losing access to a lot of considerable resources that come with that formal recognition of disability. So very a lot of entanglements, I can say.
Yes. So in Ireland,
yes,
sorry, go on.
No, that's
I just going to give you an example. In Ireland, we brought in a funding model which removed the need for diagnosis and assessment in order to receive supports for children. And it has had no impact on the level of supports being sought or assessments being sought by parents. So it hasn't been evaluated yet. So we don't know the outcome of it. But I know from the provision of psychological assessments for children looking for diagnoses has not declined, which it should have according to the new funding model. But you obviously receive something for those supports still, and parents know that. Parents with means, as you described them.
Okay, thank you. The area of intersectionality is one that would benefit from us all looking in our individual countries to to see what the issues actually are, because I think many of them, particularly around issues of poverty, would be very, very similar. We've time for one more, I think, and Professor Janti Narayan has had her hand up for some time, sitting patiently as ever there. So, Janti, over to you, please.
I was listening and absorbing, not just simply sitting patiently. That's a wrong word to use there, I suppose. It was a lot of information coming in, and I was trying to get them all into it. And Joanne, that was a very informative and thought-provoking presentation by you. And also going through this book of yours, I found so wonderful this is. And almost all have said this one thing, that we need a not only just qualified, but a sensitive teacher for successful inclusion, a teacher who's sensitive to the needs of the child. I think there lies the crux of the whole thing. Passionate, sensitive teacher, not very easy to find, but wherever we have this, whatever are the constraints, like what Rashmi was telling, somewhere tucked away in a remote area, what she gave is a small example of how it is in this country. Diversity is the beauty of our country. And it is also in many a time, the socio-economic, cultural, linguistic, geographical, all different geographical locations we have. And therefore, ecology-based assessment and planning is one of the things that we take into account. And therefore, even in those tucked away schools, if there is one teacher who is passionate about bringing out the best of the potentials in this child who is a diverse learner, it happens, right? So we have to, I believe, do a lot more with our teacher training programs, and also make sure we get those to do the courses who have an interest in working with children. Many a time we do have some people who just get into teaching not knowing what they are getting into, and then we have difficulty there, but it's not something we can control. Compared to the days when I got into special education some 50 years back, people thought I was crazy to be doing something which nobody else does. And today there is a demand for the courses all over the country. And also people from other countries come to India to learn, enroll in special education courses. The other thing that you also find is the policies are, more conducive, friendly, more child-friendly nowadays in terms of inclusion. For instance, a recent Supreme Court ruling happened that said that in every regular school, for every 10 children with disabilities, there should be at least one special educator appointed. 11th child, and there should be a second special educator. So the supply is less than the demand. The number of schools are so many, special educators generated so far is so less that now we are in the process of increasing the special educators in the country. So there's a lot more to do to make a whole thing briefer and shorter. What Rashmi said, yes, but then it is better to light a candle than to blame the darkness, isn't it? So there are things happening, and I'm sure things are getting along for the better. And then the schools everywhere are reaching out, and the teacher education program in regular education also is now including a chunk of special education, so that the regular teachers in those tucked away areas at least know something about a child who's a diverse learner in comparison to, not knowing anything at all. So things are getting better. And then people like you, when you do things like this and the international perspective that you hand us over in our hands to say this is what is happening in different countries. And also we learn from that too, and think globally, act locally. So it helps us to do that. And today your presentation has been fantastic. I just want to place that on record, that it was really, really good and gave us a lot more to think and go further. Thank you so much for it.
Thank you for that, Jayanti, and I'm so honoured to have you as part of this project. It was a really important contribution that you made as well, so thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, we've come to the end of our time, so it's beholding on me now to say a big thank you to Dr. Joanne Banks for her excellent presentation today and for being part of us. It's wonderful that we've got this technology so that we can learn from people like Joanne now. So Joanne, thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to seeing you in Dublin before too long, hopefully.
Absolutely, and thanks for the invitation. I just want to apologise for my lateness again. I'm very, very sorry about that. Thank you.
It's okay. So Rajesh, do you just want to conclude the meeting? We have another one next month, I presume. And thank you, Rajesh, for all your organisation. Perhaps you could just say something about the next meeting and maybe about the conference again, just to remind people as well.
Yes, sir. First of all, I'd like to thank Professor Banks for an excellent and wonderful and comprehensive presentation. With regard to the international conference that we are going to host with Sankalp, already the brochures have been shared. The redrafted brochure, again, we'll share it. We will also try to get emails of all the members who are there in the IIRN group so that we can send an official invite to all of you. With regard to the next month's presentation, I can see Dr. Divya is there. So she'll be presenting on 23rd of February. Dr. Divya, it is 23rd, not 24th, because 23rd and 24th I was confused. So it's 23rd of February. And she is the head of the department, Special Needs, Sri Sri Academy, Calcutta. So looking forward for that presentation from all of us here and from the mentors. Thank you, Professor Banks, for an excellent presentation. Thank you all, everybody. Good night. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.
Good night, all. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.